Thank you, Edward, and good afternoon, and thank you for inviting us, NUS, to be a curator for this particular project, Encounters with Southeast Asian Modernism. And I have quite a lot of slides, but I think we'll go fast. What Johannes, my colleague, had done was to give you a framework for understanding modernism and modernist architecture in Southeast Asia. And what I would like to do is to look at modernism in Singapore as a way of responding to that question. Now, this is a map of Singapore done survey in 1846, and it shows Singapore in its strategic location within the Southeast Asia at the tip of the Malay Peninsula with the Malacca Strait coming through. And Singapore, when it was founded 200 years ago as a colony of Britain in 1819. This year we are celebrating as well, or commemorating the bicentenary of the founding of Singapore. But of course our history went all the way back 700 years with the indigenous population here, as well as a very transient population of traders coming through, the Arabian people, the Chinese people coming through Singapore and founding the trading hub at the center here around the mouth of Singapore River. Sorry, yeah, that's Singapore River. In 1932, this map shows the very, very built-up area in around the Singapore River with all the major historical or the major states, as well as the commercial establishment around in the center. And the rest of the country is actually quite, or colony at that time, quite sparsely populated with a lot of villages or kampongs surrounding this area, with a lot of cemeteries actually and rubber plantations all around. And so this is a time in 1930s when Singapore population had increased tremendously, as well as a program for modernizing Singapore, the first phase. This is a view of Singapore in the 60s, just after the independence. You see the river, Singapore River, with a lot of junk boats for trading and all the shop houses around it, the civic district over here, the police station over here. And the civic district has the very, very important buildings, City Hall and Supreme Court, built around the 1930s, but done in a style that is totally colonial, right? So this is neoclassical style, designed by a director of the Public Works departments, Frank Dorrington Ward, in 1937. And back, I mean, even in 1937, we're talking about Bauhaus in 1919. In 1937, because of the needs of this symbolic power, this was done in the very, very classical, neoclassical style, with a little bit of localization in the somewhere around here, with some of these local traders and local farmers and workers putting on this thatch hats. And so a little bit of that, but totally neo-classical style. But at the same time, in the same year, he completed this building as the first international airport in Kallang area. And this is totally in a kind of Bauhaus or international or modernist style with really quite nice modernist materials, as you can see underneath here, and very large overhang, very, very expensive layers of openings in a tower as well as along the side. And this was done in 1937. And that is the airport building here. A very beautiful plan, right? The round plan with the runway. And of course, this is no longer there. But a very modernist building with, I mean, totally in line with the design of aircrafts at the time. Very modern symbol. But the main task for modernizing Singapore was down to a trust called the Singapore Improvement Trust. And this is one picture that they show that was built in 1937, 1939, a building in Terengganu Street, contrasting that with the very crowded shop houses along the side. A very, very contrasting image of what it was the condition of living around the central district in Singapore, but a very modernized living in the middle. Singapore Improvement Trust was set up in 1927 as a way of addressing the issues of inner city, of the slum, of the crowdedness, of the sanitary condition. And for 20 years, or maybe from 1927 to 39 or 41 before the war, it addressed issues that is in the urban center. And they even addressed the issues of back lane. We know that in shop houses, you have this very crowded urban fabric, but there wasn't a back lanes between the two blocks. So buildings abut each other. So one of the tasks of SIT was to create the back lanes. And so in their reports, they talk about what back lanes they have created, what slum they have cleared. In this report by James Fraser, he talked about the first 20 years. There wasn't any report at that time, so the first 20 years. And he talked about the condition of the inner city, the shop houses, the very, very bad, this is Covent Garden. I mean, this is not the Covent Garden of London, but with latrine over the drains and a very, very crowded area. And this is what the condition was like at that time. And more than the urban condition, the people living in there, the opium den, the slum interior, the dark room in Chinatown, and so on. So this is the contrasting image of SIT. Whether that, I mean, of course, this is real. This was real at that time. But to contrast this with image of really very clean, modernist living. So the lifestyle of the people, in contrast to what the Chinese were living in say, Upper Hokkien Street, with many members of the family squatting or living in a very small flats or small units versus the bedroom in Tiong Bahru. But in those days, Tiong Bahru was actually the main center. Now, this shown by Johannes. In that early days, in the first phase of SIT, between 1927 to 1937 or 41, this wasn't the main focus of SIT. They did not have the mandate to create a housing. They created housing in order to house those people dislocated from the slum that they cleared. Right? And so they did not have a lot of money. They had so-called a 10 million fund, but that fund was to create this improvement scheme rather than for housing. But in Tiong Bahru, they gained control of a very large plot of land from shop houses as well as from cemeteries. And they acquired in 1931, and for 5 years they put up this piece of land for private development. No one took it up because it's further away from the city, and no one wanted to take it up. And so they went in to develop their own housing, and this is the result of their housing. This is the first phase before the war, pre-war, and you can see that the housings are really quite massive. They developed it along the shop house typology of 85-foot width. And as you say, this is the, Johannes mentioned this, very similar to the sit-along that you see in Berlin, and very enclosed internal courts and external, tenements and so on. And then this was done in 1936 to 41, altogether 784 flats. But in 1945, after the war, they were trying to see whether they can start any new programs. So this is the existing block at that time, and the new program 648, 49, 46, 48, 49. And these are the new programs that they started, and these are very much in contrast to the old pre-war development. And so these are the pre-war developments. very Art Deco, as Johannes said. Look at the decorations here, but very enclosed, very heavy, with very horizontal lines. The horizontality of the buildings are done. And some of these are still around, and most of them are actually quite well preserved. These were added later, but you can still see the decorative elements here. And the circular kind of balconies with brick infill, the really very interesting adaptation of that modernist language. And they adapted the modernist language of a flat roof, so everything is flat. But of course, in the tropical weather, flat roofs doesn't work, and therefore you have this added new waterproofing. Right? So you should have a pitch roof, right? But they have the flat roof. And they actually, the SIT started with all this circular staircase, or staircases that you see now in all the revamped back lanes, as well as in this SIT flat. And the interior, again, sort of modernist, very, very well ventilated with that kind of furniture. And those were the, from the bird's eye view, you can see the Siglong type U-shaped house and all the earlier ones. So these were the later post-war buildings around here. And post-war development is slightly different from the pre-war ones. And you can see that they were all mostly individual buildings, and that are sitting within the landscape, as opposed to this one that are more enclosed kind of clusters. And this is one of them in 1953. The flats that has this 4-story high with the staircase that are decorative with this round windows, but balconies all around. And this was written by Fraser in this publication in 1948. And he talked about the new types of flats. And he said that the new flats were a complete departure from the pre-war flats. And they have this open development principle with a lot of open spaces. And so the blocks are planned in 4-story, not a very deep blocks like those in the past, but they are better lit and better ventilated and more economical to erect, because this is post-war, and therefore they needed the money to erect this. And they were designed to fit into this layout, but rising out of an open space. And so the open space are not enclosed by buildings, but the buildings are surrounded by open space. So this is like a garden city kind of arrangement, where the buildings are sitting in open space individually, rather than grouped in a cluster. And this is a new type of flats that had been used by SIT post-war, but also in Housing and Development Board after the independence of Singapore. And so these are the flats, and you can still see them being preserved. With a very simple layout, the staircase, as you can see, balcony on either side, and balcony on the other side of the flat. So the bedrooms and the living room has this natural ventilation, both sides open, and the balcony opens out, the staircase going up into the balcony. And so you have privacy as well, both in front and at the back, and you can see the open space in front. It's really quite a wonderful building. And other flats that they developed using the same kind of layout, but with one ground floor that is more open. So this previous one, the ground floor is still a housing unit, but the new, in 1949, they opened up the ground floor as a shop area. And this is a precursor with this row of columns like the Pilates in Corbusier's language. This opened up the future HDB, the Housing and Development Board's flats, with open ground floor, open deck. And so you have the void deck at the bottom that can be used for many, many purposes. And the flat actually started from above. And they also venture into really very speculative kind of housing, like this one here, or this one in Hokkien Street. It's a wonderful kind of Corbusian vision. These two were not built. But they also look into the climate of Singapore. And so equator is 85 miles away. And they look at all the statistics. It's already 1.5 million in 1958, how to house them. And so they look at the rainfall, they look at the temperature, they look at the maximum temperature in the day, and how they really adapt the architecture to the tropical climate, and therefore the beginning in Singapore of the kind of modern tropicality. And one of them is Dakota Crescent in Galang, and this is right next to the runway. So this is the Galang Airport's runway, quite close to it. And they developed the plan, which is really quite interesting in this kind of butterfly shape. And beautiful sort of buildings with 2 cores and the balconies each, with a brick facing and highlighting the central core here with a very special water tower at the bottom, at the top, and the staircase on the side, and so on. These were bricks buildings, but because of the water penetration, it was painted white. Unfortunately. These are going to be conserved, and therefore I hope the brick will be returned to its original color like this here. A very, very happy site. And now the whole estate is empty out. And so, but the architecture, the kind of patterning that you can see on the balcony, and this is wonderful. This is from a film, Satay, 1958. And how that road sort of being used by the vehicle spinning around, but the flats at the back. Really nice image here. Then they started to develop Queenstown, and with really different kind of typology, different types of layout, as well as the maintaining the similar kind of idea of individual blocks within the landscape, but together with other amenities, not just housing. And so they developed different forms and so on. And one of the more distinctive forms is this Princess Estate. At that time, when this was built, it was the highest building that they built in 1956, 14-story high. And a very, very interesting form, right? Again, probably influenced by Bauhaus, but totally a new form, or a very, very interesting adaptation for this cross ventilation with a brick built at the back. But this building was demolished. But the market is still maintained. This is the market over here, and the market in St. Michael Estate is still maintained from 1958 with that structure. Then the last project, Shirley mentioned it. I will not talk too much about it, except to want to borrow from M+ some of the archival material for exhibition in Singapore of the Conference Hall and Trade Union House, designed by Lim Chong Kiat and MAC in 1965 when it's opened. But this image also shows you the Singapore Polytechnics, which is the location where the first school of architecture was housed. And we this year celebrate the 60 years of the beginning of architecture education in Singapore. And so this is in Shenton Way, a very small building at that time. Wonderful images of the early days. Designed by Chong Kiat with very, very much concern for tropicality. Very much open ventilation, a lot of terraces, a lot of open platform, using the local materials, but also very nice hammer work. And this really summarizes the kind of tropicality that he was exploring with modern language, the language of modernism, but with local style. Thank you. Done within time, 20 minutes.